98 Africans arrived at Annapolis Harbor on September 29, 1767 aboard the Lord Ligonier. 42 had perished during the crossing. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old Mandinka warrior who would spend the next 55 years refusing to forget his name. The records from Spotsylvania County, Virginia, show a slave purchased that October given the name Toby. But what those records don't show, what plantation ledgers deliberately omitted and what family Bibles refused to acknowledge, was the systematic campaign to erase not just a man's identity, but the living memory of an entire culture. This is the story of how one African transformed the brutality meant to break him into a legacy that would outlast his captors. What you're about to hear has been obscured by 2 centuries of silence. And the truth is far more disturbing than anything you've been told. Before we continue with the story of the man who became known as Toby, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And we'd love to know, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from right now. The details of what happened next come from sources that took nearly 200 years to surface. The Gambia River cut through West Africa like a wound that never healed, carrying British ships deeper into the continent than any other waterway on that coast. By 1767, the trading outpost on James Island had processed tens of thousands of captured Africans, but the demand from Virginia tobacco plantations had reached unprecedented levels. The wars between local kingdoms created opportunities for slave raiders, and the British Royal Africa Company paid premium prices for young men with warrior training. In the village of Jufureh, 2 miles from the British fort, the Kinte clan maintained their reputation as blacksmiths and holy men despite the constant threat of raids. The Mandinka people had endured for centuries by mastering the art of appearing cooperative while maintaining their traditions in secret. They taught their children to be cautious near the river, to never venture alone into the forest, and to run at the first sight of the slaves, African slave traders who worked for European buyers. Amoro Kinte understood these dangers better than most. As a blacksmith, he'd seen the iron shackles that bound captives for transport. He'd heard the stories of villages emptied overnight, of families torn apart and sold to different ships. He taught his eldest son the traditional skills of drum making, not just as cultural preservation, but as practical knowledge. A young man who could craft instruments might be kept alive aboard a slave ship to maintain morale among the captives. The boy's name carried weight in Mandinka tradition. Kunta meant complete or whole, a name given to firstborn sons who were expected to carry on the family's legacy. At 17, he'd completed his manhood training, learned to hunt with a spear, and could recite his family's lineage back 7 generations. The village elders spoke of him as someone who would one day become a respected elder himself. On a morning in early July 1767, Kunta ventured into the forest near Jufureh to gather wood for drum making. The specific type of hardwood he needed grew 3 miles from the village, far enough to be dangerous, but close enough that many young men made the journey regularly. He carried no weapon. Mandinka warriors didn't hunt on sacred gathering grounds, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew these paths since childhood. What Kunta didn't know was that British Colonel O'Hare's forces had arrived at James Island 3 days earlier, bringing orders for a large shipment of slaves to fill Virginia's labor shortage. The Lord Ligonier sat anchored offshore, its captain under pressure to fill the ship's capacity of 140 captives before the weather turned. The usual networks of African slave traders had been mobilized, paid bonuses for young males between 15 and 25 years old. 4 slaves had been tracking Kunta since he left the village. They were professionals, men who'd perfected the art of ambush over dozens of successful captures. They knew to strike quickly, to overwhelm their target before any sound could alert nearby villages, and to bind captives so thoroughly that resistance became impossible. The attack happened with terrifying efficiency. The first blow came from behind, a wooden club striking Kunta's shoulder and driving him to his knees. Before he could cry out, hands clamped over his mouth while others pinned his arms. They moved with practiced coordination, binding his wrists with rope and wrapping cloth around his head to blindfold and gag him simultaneously. Within 90 seconds, Kunta went from free man to merchandise. The slaves dragged him 3 miles to a holding area near the river where 24 other captives sat chained in a temporary enclosure. Some were from Jufureh's neighboring villages. Others had been captured weeks earlier and transported from inland regions. All showed the same signs of shock and terror. The sudden transformation from person to property happened so quickly that the mind struggled to process it. For 3 days, Kunta remained in that holding pen while the Slaties collected more captives. The conditions were deliberately brutal. Minimal food and water, exposure to the sun during the day and cold at night, and the constant presence of guards who beat anyone who made excessive noise. The psychological impact was as calculated as the physical abuse. These men wanted captives who understood that resistance meant suffering, that cooperation was the only path to survival. When the Lord Ligonier's crew came to collect their cargo, they brought a British ship's surgeon named Drive Thompson. His job was to inspect each captive for disease, injury, or defects that might reduce their value. The examination was methodical and dehumanizing, checking teeth, feeling muscles, examining bodies with the same attention a farmer might give to livestock. Of the 32 captives presented, he rejected 7 as unsuitable. Kunta passed the inspection. At 17 years old, he was exactly what Virginia tobacco plantations needed: young, strong, and trained in physical labor from years of blacksmith work. The British paid the Slaties in rum, textiles, and iron bars, standard currency for the slave trade. Kunta became property of Captain Thomas Davies, recorded in the ship's manifest simply as male, approximately 17 years, Mandinka origin. The journey from shore to ship happened in small boats that carried 10 captives at a time. British sailors handled this transfer with practiced efficiency, knowing that this moment, when captives first saw the massive ship that would carry them across the ocean, often triggered desperate escape attempts. They kept everyone shackled and moved quickly. Kunta's first sight of the Lord Ligonier revealed the scale of what was happening. This wasn't a raid on a single village. This was an industrial operation that had been refined over decades of practice. The ship was designed specifically for human cargo, with multiple decks modified to hold as many bodies as possible in the smallest space. Other captives were already aboard, their faces visible through the cargo holds, small openings. The British crew herded the new captives below deck where they encountered conditions that defied human comprehension. The slave deck measured approximately 5 feet high, forcing everyone to crouch or lie down. The space allocated for each person was roughly 16 inches wide and 6 feet long, barely enough room to lie flat. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with sweat and fear. Wooden platforms divided the space into 2 levels, effectively doubling the number of captives that could be packed into each section. The crew chained captives together in pairs, right ankle to left ankle, making independent movement impossible. Additional chains ran along the walls, attaching to the ankle shackles and preventing anyone from reaching the stairs. The psychological impact of these restraints went beyond physical imprisonment. They made it clear that individual survival depended on the cooperation of whoever you were chained to. Kunta found himself shackled to a man named Fonta, captured from a village 50 miles inland. Neither spoke the other's dialect fluently, but they shared enough common Mandinka roots to communicate basic needs. Fonta had been imprisoned for 2 weeks and understood the ship's routines: when food came, how to position your body to avoid the worst cramps, which British sailors were most likely to inflict random beatings. The Lord Ligonier remained at anchor for another week, while Captain Davies negotiated with coastal traders for additional captives. During this time, conditions below deck deteriorated rapidly. The British provided food once per day, a mixture of beans, yams, and occasionally fish served in communal buckets that 10 people shared. Water came twice daily in small rations that left everyone in a state of chronic thirst. The waste buckets quickly overflowed, and the crew's response was to hose down the deck once every 3 days, treating the captives like livestock. Disease spread with terrifying speed in these conditions. Dysentery appeared within days, causing severe dehydration and weakness. A fever swept through one section of the hold, killing 4 men in the first week. The ship's surgeon examined the sick, but made no attempt to treat them. His job was to assess whether they might recover enough to be saleable, not to provide actual medical care. On July 5, 1767, the Lord Ligonier departed Africa with 140 captives chained below deck. Captain Davies recorded in his log that he was satisfied with the cargo's quality and expected a profitable voyage. What he didn't record was the systematic brutality required to maintain control over that many desperate people trapped in nightmare conditions. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, typically took between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather conditions. The Lord Ligonier's route would carry them past the Cape Verde Islands, then southwest across the ocean's widest point before catching the trade winds toward the Caribbean and up the North American coast to Annapolis. For the captives, the voyage became an endless cycle of suffering punctuated by brief moments on deck. British policy required bringing slaves topside once per day for exercise, 30 minutes of forced movement while still shackled, ostensibly to prevent muscle atrophy, but really to reduce the death rate enough to protect profits. These moments provided the first opportunity for captives to communicate across language barriers and recognize the scale of their collective situation. Kunta's training as a warrior and his cultural education proved useless in this context. Everything he'd learned about courage, honor, and resistance meant nothing when you were chained in darkness with no weapon and no knowledge of where the ship was taking you. The psychological torment was methodical. Isolation from everyone who shared your language, uncertainty about your destination, and the physical weakness from minimal food and water that made clear thinking nearly impossible. But Kunta noticed patterns in the British crew's behavior. The sailors who brought food were less vigilant during rough weather. The deck exercise happened at the same time each day unless storms prevented it. The ship's surgeon rarely ventured into the holds between formal inspections. These observations meant nothing in terms of immediate escape, but they indicated that the ship's operations followed routines that could potentially be exploited. Other captives made similar observations. A man named Cody, who'd been a trader before his capture, understood some English from dealing with British merchants. He listened carefully to conversations among the crew and reported what he learned to those around him. The ship was bound for Naples, which some captives recognized as the Mandinka pronunciation of Annapolis. They would be sold at auction to work on tobacco plantations. The British expected most of them to die within 10 years from brutal labor conditions. This information created an impossible dilemma. Several captives discussed attempting a rebellion once enough of them reached the deck simultaneously. But the shackles made coordinated action nearly impossible, and the British crew was armed with muskets and cutlasses. Any rebellion that failed would result in immediate execution of everyone involved. The risk calculation was brutal. Attempt escape and almost certainly die, or accept slavery with the slim possibility of eventual freedom. Kunta listened to these debates but didn't participate. His father had taught him that warriors choose their battles based on realistic assessment of victory chances, not on pride or desperation. Everything about their current situation made rebellion suicidal. But he filed away every detail about the ship's routines, every weakness in the British crew's procedures, every piece of information that might prove useful later. 3 weeks into the voyage, a fever swept through the hold with devastating speed. The same conditions that made the space hellish: extreme heat, lack of ventilation, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, created perfect breeding grounds for infectious disease. Men who'd survived capture and the journey to the ship died shackled to their partners. Their bodies left in place for hours or sometimes days until the crew noticed and removed them. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Thompson, recorded each death in his log with clinical detachment. By his calculation, a 15% mortality rate was acceptable on slaving voyages. 30% required investigation. If deaths exceeded 40%, the captain would face scrutiny from the Royal Africa Company for mismanagement. The dead weren't people who'd lost their lives, they were inventory that affected profit margins. Kunta's partner Fanta developed the fever during the 4th week. The early symptoms were unmistakable: shaking chills despite the oppressive heat, severe headache, growing delirium. Fanta remained lucid enough to recognize what was happening to him, and in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, he apologized to Kunta for what would come next. Within 2 days, Fanta died, and Kunta spent 18 hours chained to a corpse before the British crew noticed and removed the body. The crew didn't provide Kunta with a new partner. Instead, they shortened his ankle chain and attached it directly to the wall, giving him even less mobility than before. This isolation was unintentional. The crew simply hadn't captured enough slaves to replace all the dead. But it intensified Kunta's psychological torment. For weeks afterward, he existed in a state of near-total sensory deprivation, surrounded by suffering people, but unable to communicate meaningfully with anyone. Just when we thought we'd understood the full horror of the Middle Passage, the conditions aboard the Lord Ligonier grew even worse. The weather turned violent as the ship approached the Atlantic center. And what happened next would test every survivor's will to live. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, hit that like button to support our content. Share this video with someone who should hear this history, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Let's continue with the nightmare that was still unfolding. The storm struck during the 7th week at sea. Atlantic storms in late summer tested even experienced ships like the Lord Ligonier. Captain Davies had crossed this route 24 times, but every voyage brought weather that could turn deadly within hours. The first signs came at dawn. A sudden wind shift, clouds building on the western horizon, an ominous drop in atmospheric pressure that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Davies ordered the crew to secure all cargo and prepare for rough seas. For the captives chained below deck, this preparation meant absolutely nothing changed. They remained shackled in the same positions. But now the ship began to pitch and roll with increasing violence. Men who'd been lying down were suddenly thrown against their chains as the vessel lurched sideways. The wooden platforms above their heads creaked and groaned, threatening to collapse under the shifting weight. The worst part was the water. Atlantic storms drive waves over the deck. And on slave ships, that water had nowhere to go except down into the holds through the small ventilation grates. Within hours, 6 inches of seawater sloshed back and forth across the slave deck, mixing with waste from the overflowing buckets and creating a toxic soup that captives couldn't escape. The shackles kept everyone pinned in place while contaminated water washed over them repeatedly. Kunta had experienced tropical storms in Africa, but nothing prepared him for the helplessness of being chained during a maritime disaster. The ship would rise on a wave, pause at the crest, then plunge downward with enough force to lift chained bodies briefly off the wooden platforms before slamming them back down. The sounds were terrifying. Timbers groaning under stress, crew members shouting orders overhead, and all around him the cries of men convinced the ship was sinking and they would drown while shackled in the darkness. The storm lasted 4 days. During that time, the British crew made no attempt to bring food or water below deck. Maintaining their own safety took priority over preserving their cargo. The captives existed in a nightmare state of thirst, hunger, violent motion, and the constant fear that the next wave would be the one that broke the ship apart. Several men lost their minds during those 4 days, screaming continuously until their voices gave out, then continuing to scream silently with mouths open and eyes showing nothing but terror.